Gideon, John, both, thank you very much indeed for coming and welcome. We sit here Wednesday lunchtime and Donald Trump's now down in Portsmouth, so the main sort of transactions of his visit are done. Did we learn anything from President Trump's visit to our shores?
I think we learned a couple of things. I have the sense that the world is gradually getting used to Donald Trump, so that the kind of outrage that you had even a couple of years ago in Britain, it's still there, but it's diminishing. So, the demonstrations were lower key than you might otherwise have imagined.
Rather than a quarter of a million.
Yeah, exactly. And it was sort of the usual suspects demonstrating, and politicians like Jeremy Corbyn and Sadiq Khan took the positions you would expect them to. And in some ways, I almost felt that, say, Sadiq Khan and Donald Trump were doing each other a favour. They were playing ritual roles, probably helped Sadiq Khan to be denounced by Donald Trump, and Trump relishes these kind of Barneys with people like Khan. So, and I thought the other thing that struck me is the way in which now the US, or the possibility of a US-UK trade deal, is now playing quite directly into British politics, with the Tory leadership coming up and obviously the harder line people, the Boris Johnsons, very much looking at that as the thing they can hold up as compensating for a hard Brexit, and the skeptics and the Remainers saying, no, this is a complete lure and it's never going to happen, and if it does, it will be at the expense of the National Health Service or whatever. So, from being a relatively abstract thing, it's now kind of inserted itself in the centre of UK politics.
Quite striking how relaxed Trump was, and actually mildly charmed the press back yesterday. I thought he performed quite effectively, and you saw sort of obelisk-like Theresa May beside him, and it was kind of odd distinction. And secondly, there are certain things that Donald Trump does believe in. President Trump burns down NATO, doesn't believe in the United Nations, all these sort of Sibylists of the post-Second World War Anglo-American worldview. Many of those things he puts in the bin, but actually does believe in something like the special relationship. So I thought that came across quite strongly. And even when he was sort of playing with the NHS in terms of the trade deal, I mean, that's Trump. Back at home, he's talking of graduated 5% increase on tariffs of anything coming in from Mexico. Republicans at home are going crazy as well. So I mean, we took that kind of very seriously, and notably he backed down later in the day. But I think, if you're Boris, that was a pretty good meeting yesterday with Trump. Even if you're Jeremy Hunt, seemed to perform quite well in the front row of the audience as well.
You think some of the toxicity of Donald Trump may have reduced, both of you think, because not so long ago, one might have said looking like his pet British politician would be a really big negative.
Well, the bar has been lowered consistently. I mean, so the question is, when's peak exhaustion with Trumpism? And he went pretty far during the campaign. There was so much exposed during that process. You've had the Mueller report, and there's a kind of a leveling out, and that does not scratch all the things he said from the record previously. But as you kind of look around the world, as Britain's options or potential room for manoeuvre seems to contract a little bit, I think there's perhaps a little bit more realism about it all. And that may kind of lead to kind of a shrugging of the shoulders. He did have the people were giggling in the press gallery yesterday. He was in kind of quite cute form, Trump. He was quite quick on his feet. That kind of genuine sense of outrage is not as palpable as it was when he was first elected.
I wondered whether, Gideon, you were speaking a little bit for yourself. Maybe these were your personal reactions as you watched. I remember you saying, writing that you thought it was going to be excruciating. Were you not hiding behind the sofa?
No, I mean, I thought that, obviously May's situation is pretty excruciating, but Trump was relatively graceful about that, and when he said, why don't you stick around to do the trade deal? I mean, obviously she's not going to, but it was a relatively sort of tactful way of dealing with it. He didn't, as he might have done in other situations, rub her nose in it or whatever. But I do think that, I mean, maybe we shouldn't be getting used to it, but people are getting used to Trump's behavior.
Isn't there?
Yeah, people start saying, use this term a lot, his behavior, like his tweets about Khan, which 2 years ago would have been regarded as absolutely extraordinary, and people still use the term unpresidential. But the point is, he is the president. So we're having a new form of presidential behavior. And whether people are getting used to it, tuning it out or whatever, look, I don't think we'll ever get entirely used to it, but things are changing. And I think the other thing is that British politics is so polarized now, more polarized than I can remember it, that in a sense, to the extent that a group will attack Trump, the other group, the sort of Brexiter party, which are doing well, Farage obviously thinks it's a plus to be in with Trump.
Are we now sufficiently polarised then to be able to say Boris Johnson, potentially our next Prime Minister, is a Trumpian figure? We are moving where America was not so long before us.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always been some ambiguity about whether Boris is a Trumpian figure. We all remember that early on he kind of denounced Trump and said he'd hate to meet him if he was in New York. The greatest danger of going to New York might be meeting Donald Trump. But then trying to observe both political processes, maybe I was being a bit sort of kind on the UK. I felt that Trump was a far more extreme figure than, say, Boris. But you could make the case that actually Boris was practicing a form of Britishified Trumpian politics with extreme claims like the famous 350 million, which he's now being sued over, which some would say were Trumpian-style lies, that the race baiting that Trump is accused of, well, Boris Johnson is also accused of, again, in a sort of more satirical, soft, soapy British kind of way. But if you wanted to make that case, you could say actually there are some similarities between the Trumpian pitch and the Boris pitch.
I think of it more as an analogue. There's always an analogue in Anglo-American relations. There's a kind of through a refracted mirror, similarities between Thatcher and Reagan. They're not exact matches, but I think the question vis-a-vis Trump is the same fundamental question that sort of the open question in British politics, whereby is the Trumpian kind of degeneration of language, political discourse, the kind of radicalization of tone, is that a kind of a slippery slope, and that's the bar has now been eternally lowered, or is it kind of a protracted rebirth? And the same applies to British politics. I would still say that, notwithstanding the sort of pollution of tone of British politics post-Brexit, it's on nothing like the scale of the United States. So that I think there's a kind of significant difference there, and we shouldn't trick ourselves into believing anything but that.
Yeah, and I think that's probably right. And I think there may be a sort of difference in personality as well, in that I think that Boris Johnson is somebody who is more authentically part of the liberal elite or the metropolitan elite. He's now despised by many of his old friends, but that's still kind of his milieu in a way that it was never really Trump's milieu.
Look at the family he came from.
Absolutely.
His siblings.
And I don't think that, I don't think that Boris Johnson would be quite as happy about burning those bridges as Trump was and is. But just picking up on something that John said earlier about Trump really believing in the special relationship. I mean, maybe, but I wonder whether Trump really believes in anything. And talking slightly out of school, I remember talking to one of his friends before his first trip here, not the state visit, who'd said that he had said, "Oh, Mr. President, but obviously you must have a special feeling in your heart for Britain because your mother was Scottish." And Trump apparently said, "Yeah, but my father was, of German descent. And anyway, they've ruined that country because of all the immigration," which is allegedly what Trump said. So, I mean, I don't know what he really thinks about anything.
I mean, he's more willing to pay lip service to the special relationship or a version of that than he is on any of the other issues. So his
might be as far as it goes.
That might be as far as it goes, but if you think about NATO, you think about relationship with Germany, which of course is a crucial relationship with the United States historically. I mean, his role in those relationships or in discussing those types of things is to be provocateur and dismissive and destructive
maybe
of them.
Japan he's been quite key, helpful with, but I think Japan's also an interesting analogy because Abe's gone out of his way to cultivate Trump in ways that the Japanese, I think, feel is a little bit humiliating. And it sort of worked, but you could never rule out the idea that Trump will turn on them and then he'll suddenly impose auto tariffs on Japan. And I think if he felt it necessary to apply pressure to do Britain in a similar way, he would do it without compunction. I
mean, it is America first, but there are second and third tier relationships in that as well. And some of them are deteriorating and some of them, are just about withstanding the storm.
Watching his family come over with him, some of them people that don't get seen a great deal, thinking that it's worth the trip coming here, dressing up for Buckingham Palace, the rest of it. I mean, to what extent is the Trump regime, maybe even Washington more generally, taking Britain seriously? To what extent have we become a theme park that they look in on with a duty-free shop attached?
think back to Pinochet, or I mean, this has always been a part of the appeal and part of the pageantry. Think back to Xi Jinping's visit a few years ago. I mean, this is a kind of an element of British soft power, call it what you will, an element of esteem that plays back. And it's just my instinct tells me the Trump family came over, more of them, as you say, than we've ever seen before, popping up from everywhere. Came over in caravan.
Something I haven't seen for a while.
It's not to say perhaps Donald Trump likes a theme park, and he wouldn't be the first leader of another country to enjoy that sort of theme park attention. I don't think that means we're sort of suddenly giving up on our own seriousness. Perhaps the spotlight is focusing on that because of other reasons of political status in the kind of normal machine. But
the fact we didn't have a prime minister who was going to be there for very long meant that side of business was
exactly. But it was ever thus. That's my point.
In a funny way, the counterpoint between the prime minister who was going to be out by Friday and the Queen who's been there forever was quite an interesting one. And to that extent, playing up the royal bit and the pageantry was served a diplomatic purpose, because I think it sort of said, Britain actually is a very stable place with a lot of continuity and a lot of history at a time when the day-to-day politics looks completely in flux. So that was quite a helpful message to send.
You mentioned at the beginning that one bit of the day-to-day politics and how he dipped his toe into the trade issue in that press conference, President Trump. It was very interesting, wasn't it, that the Tory leadership candidates, some of them arch Brexiteers, piled in after President Trump had mentioned the NHS. Possibly being part of a trade negotiation. And they didn't just stop there. Some of them started saying, and no to agriculture, and joining the regime, regulation regime of America on that as well. I mean, they sounded a bit like some EU 27 leaders, some of them. Where does this go? I mean, are we actually at the beginning of a process where that whole nirvana of the US-UK trade agreement collapses and it ceases to be to mix my metaphors, the Jerusalem or whatever of this whole project?
People who know about trade have always said, maybe you can do it and it would be great in some respects, but it'll be very, very hard slog. It could take many years. I mean, Trump is clearly not being, accurate when he says you can do it overnight. There's no trade deals done overnight. Say, for example, EU-Canada, which was relatively unproblematic, took 7 years. So it would take a long time to negotiate. Secondly, if you look at the powerful interests in America, they are agriculture and the healthcare industry. These are the big wins. You would expect America to ask for these things. It will, and I think Britain might find if we said no, the whole process slowed down and began to kind of grind to a halt. And I think finally, the other thing that's really stuck in my mind is when Nancy Pelosi was here and she said, look, if you violate the Good Friday Agreement, there's no way this is going through Congress. And the Irish-American lobby could be reawakened on this issue. So Britain could be in a catch-22 where we don't have anything to offer America unless we do violate the Good Friday Agreement by getting out of the customs accord, et cetera, et cetera. But if we do that, then we make the chances of the deal getting through in America much harder. And equally, I mean, the stuff you said about the Tories' reaction, I think is kind of interesting because, of course, they're from the patriotic wing, inverted commas, of British politics. So they have to be careful about anything that makes Britain look like a poodle, even as they're very pro-American.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the Tory leadership, so Matt Hancock coming out, for example, and saying, not on my watch would any undermining of the NHS go on. I mean, that shows that nothing changes in British politics. I mean, that has to be the starting point. On Pelosi and the kind of Irish-American lobby, I mean, that's sort of mood music in the background. I mean, like the Irish-American lobby has never been particularly helpful, including during the IRA campaign. And Attlee doesn't have a great knowledge or expertise beyond some key talking points on the Good Friday Agreement. So one wonders how serious that is, although quite a lot was made of it at the time. And I agree. I mean, the point of Brexit is at its best, it is a kind of a bet on a speculative version of the future in which free trade deals are important. Just the one thing I'd say about it, can you imagine the despair if Trump had came and said what he was saying a while ago, which was Theresa May's deal, or a version of Theresa May's deal, which Boris Johnson has said today essentially he will pursue, that would be insufficient to pursue a free trade deal with the United States. So actually kind of opened the door a little bit more widely than he has done before. But if he'd shut it down in some respects, or there was kind of the mood music was all against some sort of free trade deal, then the bet on the speculative future, whether this thing works or not, would be shut down. So it just keeps a little bit of alive a sort of Brexit self-confidence. I think Boris will need to, should he become leader, kind of pursue a bit of a approach he wants to pursue.
It's a reminder as well, though, isn't it? At the moment when we might be shifting our gaze away from the Channel quite so much and across the Atlantic, trade talks are not necessarily a time of enormous happiness and smoothness. I mean, we could be actually making, they can be quite a fractious time in relations. Embarking on one is no mean feat.
Yeah, I mean, so NAFTA, the current tension between the US and Mexico, Gideon mentioned earlier, despite Abe's best effort, the constant threat of taxes on Japanese cars coming to the United States. I mean, this is not an easy thing. This is a kind of a Hobbesian world into which we enter. Yeah. And there's no point being sort of misty-eyed about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's all sorts of problems to do with what, in a sense, Trump himself is doing to the trading system, so that when the Conservatives talk about a no-deal Brexit, essentially, well, we'll just rely on WTO rules. Well, the WTO is in considerable trouble at the moment, might break down over the US-Chinese trade dispute. I don't know whether they'll be able to cope with the mutual complaints that both sides are making, particularly since the US is blocking the appellate court from actually functioning by not blocking the appointment of judges. But I think also with the EU and the US, there's a sequencing question, because we will simultaneously be trying to negotiate the new trade deal with the European Union as soon as we come out. That's the next stage of talks, and trade deal with America. But which deal you get depends on the terms of the other one. So that if we, have a certain sort of agricultural deal with the European Union, that would affect what we could offer to America and vice versa. I
suppose one of the things that goes through one's mind as one watches a little explosion like this, the first time we're getting into the granular detail, not even the granular detail, but the sort of Google Earth detail of trade deals is, are the British really pro-free trade massively, or were we able to hide behind the French skirts because we were more free trade than they were in EU negotiations, and we actually won't like what we're confronted with, and we might have TTIP style sort of demonstrations on the street when we get into this whole world of trade, which kind of Donald Trump has lifted the skirt on this week.
Who is really openly pro-free trade? I mean, the British sense of itself after 1945, the British are far more pro-free trade than the Americans. Clement Attlee famously said the Americans had this great idea, which is, free trade for everyone else, but not for them. So I mean, that's, who is a pure free trader? Beyond. I guess that a vision such as that exists in parts of Southeast Asia, for example, but beyond that, I mean, I don't think that you're right. I mean, so it has a series of potential knock-on effects on, protected, cloistered industries, parts of agriculture, etc. I think we're just at the start of a kind of a new version of politics, in which you're going to see those tensions be very much, regionally focused.
A very old one that's come back.
Yeah, also possibly true. Back to the mid-19th century, I suppose.
One of the things Donald Trump seemed to be saying was, on Brexit, get on with it. And I just wondered, both of you with your knowledge of not just America, but other countries, and European ones included, do you think that is now the dominant view, even in countries that maybe hoped we'd stay in and somehow there'd be a rethink? Gideon?
No, I don't think it is. And to the extent that Trump says get on with it, that will awaken some sentiment in Europe. Will think, well, maybe Britain is being kind of instrumentalized by a Trump who's actually hostile to the European Union. I think that people in Brussels do think that Trump is backing forces that are essentially want to destroy the EU. And that then plays into their Brexit debate, not very directly, but for example, in the European Parliament, when Verhofstadt, who's an arch Remainer, was saying Britain should just leave, it's enough already. Donald Tusk stood up and said, you do realize you're saying exactly the same thing as Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, and shouldn't that make you think harder about this? So I think the European reaction to this is a bit complicated, but and again, that will also be affected by if Boris Johnson becomes Prime Minister, how he plays it, what the state of play between Johnson and Parliament is coming up. But I think that there is still a considerable body of opinion in Europe that thinks, this whole thing's in flux and it could end with the UK staying, and on balance, that would be better for them than us leaving. But there's a range of opinions.
A caveat on that, just to bring out the range of opinion, you're right on Brussels, but of course Macron came out yesterday again and said, get it done. And then what
and
really
get it done
matters,
by October the 31st.
Yeah, exactly. And what really matters also is the succession to Angela Merkel and the tensions within the CDU as well. And basically that there's a concern, but Brexit is playing into that as well. And there's a desire to do it. I would say the prevalent desire in Germany is to do it in an orderly fashion. And that again is having knock-on effects in Ireland as well. So, you're right in terms of Brussels Central, and that always has been the sort of sentiment. But I think we're likely to see kind of an increasing of the gears to get something done.
It could happen, but I think, it's hard to read. I was talking to some French colleagues, follow the Elysée quite closely, and they said, look, Macron has to say, get it done. It's sort of what's needed in French politics. But in the end, he's not going to be the guy who wants to take responsibility for stamping on Britain's fingers and getting, pushing them overboard in October, if that's what it looks like. And similarly, Germany, the Franco-German relations not in great shape either. And I think there was some irritation at the last European summit that Macron was pushing too hard, and he got pushed back a little bit. But I suppose it's not, nothing's preordained, I suppose.
If you were guessing and assuming on a Boris Johnson premiership, do you think there'll still be members on the 1st of November and therefore probably until at least next summer and maybe even longer than that?
You've asked us to do the hardest thing, which is to guess what happens next in Brexit, but I'll give it a go for the sake of entertainment.
You first.
I would suggest we will be out by the 1st of November, and I think, this will provoke hysteria in some quarters. I think there's a slow elements of potential compromise vis-a-vis the backstop, which is now the sort of still the obstacle, the most serious obstacle. Increasingly, in terms of shifting in German leadership, the sort of desire not to have that issue be the one that pushes Britain out with no deal, and I can imagine some sort of imaginative compromise. Now, for that, it has to be done in a way in which no one is seen to be steamrollered or pushed into a corner. But the other reality of the backstop is and always has been that if this leads to the no-deal Brexit, then the hard border comes anyway. The Irish government in particular is extremely vulnerable to that scenario. But I've said this before, and I always thought that kind of the way the stars align, this is where we would end up. But I think that's where we're going. And the other, of course, the domestic political factor that makes that crucial. But if Boris's whole premise of leadership is that I'm the person to knock out the threat from the Brexit Party and Nigel Farage, then Brexit does need to be done by that time. So I think domestically and internationally we are heading to a situation where some sort of deal or some sort of creative solution, and it's not beyond the wit of man to do that, by the way.
But if you were putting a bet on which is the more likely way of us leaving,
some sort of managed deal by 1st of November, that would be my gut instinct.
Does that feel
right? Okay, so for the sake of argument, like John, I obviously can't know, but I sort of funny feeling we'll still be on the 1st of November, that the European Union will offer enough to keep Boris from walking away, but it won't be nailed down, and so that they'll say there'll be some kind of extension, and maybe this is wishful thinking, but in the end that the whole process might get glued down. I think the difficulty from the European Union's point of view is October extension they could do technically, but by April they're getting into the next budget negotiations and they really need to know whether they can count on that British money or not. And I think similarly for a British government to commit to being in the next EU budget might be just too much.
One of the arguments that's getting deployed in the Tory leadership contest by Boris Johnson's opponents is they're not going to give him anything. The EU, the last thing they're going to want to do is present a cherished crown on a silk cushion to him of all people and pump adrenaline into populists across Europe as they might see it. Is there nothing to that?
Well, what can they give him? I mean, not much different than what the Prime Minister has. They give him clarification or refinement. The most they can give him is perhaps a time limit on the backstop or some sort of ambiguity which allows the UK in certain circumstances to exit that mechanism in a putative potential future. So that's no great triumph over what the Prime Minister has got. And there's the paradox of the whole thing. I mean, coming in as some sort of transformative political force, and yet his stated position is a whisker, a cigarette paper different from the current Prime Minister's current negotiating strategy, and that is the paradox here.
But do you think the ERG would buy that?
I think if we're getting up to 31st of October, possibly yes. Actually, yes.
I can see a scenario where the ERG and maybe even the DUP helped with the ERG and coming on board.
Both were
for
quite
that.
close.
But wouldn't the European Union be pushing Leo Varadkar over a political cliff by putting a deadline?
I mean, there's a lot written. I read the Irish papers very regularly. A lot written in the Irish Times and the Sunday Business Post. And you have people like Dan O'Brien, pro-EU senior economist, who said from the outset that while Dublin has had a very effective tactical negotiation and has an understandable position for lots of other contingent factors, that actually strategically it was a dangerous position for Dublin to adopt to make the backstop this kind of issue. And again, we, as the UK, face certain paradoxes. Boris Johnson faces certain paradoxes, but the reality of having a no-deal Brexit means the Irish government has to put up a hard border in the island of Ireland, and that has not been thought through either. So the point is not to have some sort of triumph or victory over Leo Varadkar. It's to actually, I think, if I was the British government, focus on trying to repair elements of Anglo-Irish relations and have some sort of fudge and ambiguous terms of commitment that the DUP can just about accept. But remember, also the DUP do not want to see no deal. Agricultural interests in Northern Ireland do not want to see no deal. But simultaneously, the same group of people do have genuine concerns about the backstop. So the direction of travel is that if all interested parties want some sort of managed deal, and sort of the terms and conditions of the backstop are the kind of the key thing, then that suggests to me that there is some sort of solution.
And the EU wouldn't have to have Boris Johnson for dinner at European councils,
which I
as
imagine
far
would
as
be
the
a
eye can
relief.
see, which would be presumably a relief.
No, I mean, I think it is the case that they genuinely detest him, partly because he was the face of the Leave campaign. But, on the other hand, as we were saying about Donald Trump, you can get used to people after a while. You detest, if you have to deal with them, politicians are nothing if not generally pragmatic. They'll have to deal with it.
You wrote, Gideon, about the narrative of humiliation that countries can adopt and the dangers of that. You worry that you can see something like that developing in our politics?
Yeah, I think very much so, because I think generally, people tend not to say it's all my fault, I got it wrong, I'm going to rethink. That's not the human reaction. So let's say you have a no-deal Brexit and you have the real chaos for a while. The reaction of certainly of a Johnson-led government isn't going to be well, we got it wrong. It will be to rally the country and to rally the country against Europe. I mean, you look at the sort of D-Day celebrations now. It's not that far beneath the surface in British life. And similarly, but if we were to reverse, that would be seen as a big humiliation by a lot of people and would feed a kind of stab in the back theory. So I think there are dangers for Britain if what was seen as this great act of we can do it actually ends up going kind of quite badly wrong. There'll be a hunt on for enemies, and there'll be enemies within and there'll be enemies without. Maybe I'm prey to the national myth. I think that British politics is less prone to that than other countries, but I think it would be complacent to say that Britain couldn't go that way.
At the end of this whole Brexit process then, let's assume that it happens, our influence, you, John, were quoting the other day Tony Blair talking about the pivotal nation that tries to sort of influence the whole sort of movements of the globe. Are we sort of crashing down a lift shaft of influence, and will we wake up bruised on a much lower floor than we ever expected.
I mean, as long as we wake up, we can cope with some bruises. So the Blair's point about the pivotal nation, the bridge between Europe and the Atlantic, or Churchill's three concentric circles, Commonwealth, Empire in Churchill's case, Europe and the United States. I mean, that balancing act has always been a balancing act, and it's probably more difficult to maintain in this scenario. That having been said, if you take the long view, and I don't want to be too fatalistic or pessimistic about it, or declinist about it, if you are realistic about the sort of metrics of British power, if the City of London's economic weight or influence is preserved, even if we have a completely botched post-Brexit industrial strategy, Five Eyes intelligence relationship, serious, competent military power that's now expanding its role, rightly or wrongly, in the Asia Pacific. I mean, those things aren't kind of washed away overnight. UN Security Council seat, there's still things that give Britain sort of punch in the international system, but none of this is kind of inevitable. And set aside, imagine Brexit never happened. Britain's seat in the UN Security Council was already being questioned by rising powers in India or Asia in general. So we carved out a privileged place for ourselves in the world in 1945 when we kind of limped to the finishing line, and we sat as one of the big three, and we created this international order, and we had a great position for ourselves in that order. And elements of that order are starting to fall apart naturally by the passage of time.
I'm a little bit more fatalistic in the sense that I think if you look at big economic shifts, above all the kind of rise of Asia, the rise of China in particular, but also India and so on, economic weight has been moving towards Asia. Britain is a Western power with its power sort of rooted in that post-1945 order that John just described, which was a West-dominated world. And so that was always going to be uncomfortable. Now, Britain has used a couple of force magnifiers, the EU membership, the special relationship with the US, and in almost a kind of inherited sense that we were global players, so we should continue to be that, and we were accepted as that. But I think that, in a sense, Brexit has now raised questions both domestically and internationally about, where exactly is Britain? Should we still take the UK seriously as a big player? And I also think that, for me, I used to have some sympathy with some of the Eurosceptic arguments about sovereignty and so on, but I'm less sympathetic to them now because of the way the world's moving. I think it's going to be important, or potentially important, to Britain to be part of, in a world in which we have a very powerful and assertive China and an America first, the United States, which is also throwing its weight around. It seems to me really quite risky to cut ourselves loose from what is potentially the third bloc, at least on trade, which is the European Union. The EU is a big market, and it has power in these trade negotiations, and economic warfare seems to be the way we're going between the US and China. If you're the EU, you've got some bulk. If you're Britain, less so.
Can I ask a slightly brutal question to close with about bringing it back to this nation state? And you were talking about whether we're taken seriously around the world. Do you both talk to people from international think tanks, international statesmen, people from other countries? Are we not laughed at right now? And how long can you carry on being laughed at before you take a serious tumble?
Well, it comes back to that whole narrative of humiliation. I really think we should resist the idea that we're being laughed at.
I bet you start every single lunch with a foreign statesman or a foreign think tank with a joke about Britain?
No, I don't apologise. I just say, look, it's...
They bring up a joke? No?
It is, look, it's not so great to be an American intellectual at the moment with Donald Trump as your president. It's not terrific to be a Russian or a Chinese, or an Italian. Everybody's got their problems. And Britons are pretty much on display. And yeah, I think there's, maybe there's some sort of sniggering, but I wouldn't really worry about that. I would worry more about something more concrete, which is that people have got beginning to not look around when there's like a big international problem and say, well, what's the British point of view? And you saw that even before Brexit. I mean, Ukraine was a really interesting example where Merkel, with a bit of Hollande, and Obama, essentially, with the West dealing with that, where was David Cameron on that? He kind of forgot about it. And I thought that was an early sign of the British sort of slipping off the map, and that was pre-Brexit.
I mean, with the punchline joke in international conferences?
I actually don't believe that at all. I mean, we are so status anxiety obsessed, and this has been the refrain since the east of Suez, perhaps before that, in the 50s as well. This is a standard part of the British debate. I remember constant pieces in the front page of the Times, etc. London's bridge is falling down. You have a kind of third level State Department official come and say, actually, the special relationship is not that important. Cue op-ed after op-ed. We're obsessed with this. And we also mock this concept of global Britain as supposed to be our new foreign policy. And I don't want to say too much about this for lots of reasons. But what's quite striking is that other people in the rest of the world are quite attracted to the idea of global Britain. Because when we do involve ourselves as a UN Security Council member, we are seen as a kind of responsible player, one that is not following President Trump on climate change or the Iranian nuclear deal, for example. So Gideon's point is it's the fact that Britain is absent from a number of these negotiations, or say this, the attempts to rebuild Syria, which have been taken out of the West elsewhere. People bemoan that absence. So if you talk to people from Japan or Australia or South Korea, they often say, global Britain, that sounds great. What does it mean in practice? So I think that's a question we have to answer for ourselves, and we have now tougher strategic choices calcifying. We've had this great luxury since the end of the Cold War, whereby our closest ally was supreme and self-confident, and therefore the choices we made were kind of in the slipstream, if you like, of American grand strategy, and therefore they were choices of luxury. Often very difficult ones, from Iraq through to Libya. That paradigm is over. It was going to be over anyway, whatever happened with Brexit. So we need to sort of wake up to that reality, and what happens next is still in our national gift. So I think we can sort of be too deterministic about the idea on some sort of mission towards decline.
Thank you both very much indeed. Frankie Howard, titter ye not, I think you're saying. Very grateful for your time. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.